Hello, my name is Patrick Shea from the University of Houston, and I'm going to talk about a new paper I have with Paul Poast from the University of Chicago on leaders and defaults. And in the paper, we're looking for characteristics of leaders that would lead them to make the serious decision to default on their sovereign debt. So we begin with leaders in general, and leaders generally pursue some ambitious fiscal projects to stay in power. So they want to buy their constituents stuff. That stuff could be social welfare projects, new infrastructure, new economic investments, or even war. And there's a couple ways you can pay for these. They're generally costly, but there's ways to do this. And you can pay for this through inflation, where you just print money, but that can have disastrous economic consequences. Or you can pay for this through taxes, which has generally bad political consequences because people generally do not like taxes. So an alternative way that leaders can pay for their fiscal projects are to borrow money through credits. And credit provides several benefits. First, it allows them to stay in power longer because it essentially puts the costs of their project off into the future. It mitigates political opposition as it doesn't give the opposition much firepower to oppose these ambitious projects. And in general, states that can borrow more money, the leaders in those states have freer hand to implement policy. And as a result, as we see a lot of states borrow money. So from this graph, states that are lighter blue borrow more money. And even states that are darker blue, mostly petrostates, they are borrowing at a higher rate than they normally do, given the advantages of borrowing money. So, and some so far as credit is very important. And as a result, about 20% of all global financial assets is sovereign credit, states borrowing money. But states default. They don't always keep their promises. So despite the fact that credit is very important, some leaders decide to renege on their promises. And what we argue in this paper is that the leaders that come into power through irregular means, so means that are not specified by existing institutions or rules, are more likely to default. And the example that we build off in this paper is the Bolshevik Revolution, and specifically Lenin's decision to default on the Tsarist debts in 1918. And so in 1918, the new Soviet government had a decision to how to pay for food shortages, and they decided to forego their debt responsibilities and instead use the money that was supposed to go to this debt repayment and use it for food payment in general. And this is not just an artifact of history. More recently, we've seen Lebanon, the new government, default on its debt obligations and using that money instead to pay for popular social programs. And so we think there's several reasons why these irregular leaders that come into power through unexpected or into the contravention of their rules, to be more likely to default. So one is that these types of leadership transitions are more likely to promote leaders that aren't good at managing debt. So these are leaders that aren't necessarily competent at their jobs. These leaders are also more likely to prioritize short-term benefits because these are the type of leaders that don't stay in power long, and so they are not going to invest in long-term investments. These leaders are also more likely to be political outsiders. And default is an effective way to create distance from the previous regimes. Essentially, as creditors, particularly external creditors, are salient scapegoats. So you can blame the banks from other countries for the problems that are going on in your own country, right? And so what we derive from all this is that irregular leadership changes are going to be associated with more defaults. So we take this expectation to the data, and we're going to examine leaders and defaults at the country level from 1875 to 2015. So this is going to cover both time and space in terms of data. And we're interested in states' decisions to default on their loans. And we take this from Reinhardt and Rogoff's default data. Irregular leadership changes, we are taking the definition from the Archegos data sets. And again, they define irregular leaders as those leaders that come into power through means that aren't consistent with the rules of the states. And we're going to control for a lot of things that might confound our argument. And what we really wanted to control for is the fact that this is not just a fact of political instability or economic instability. It's something about the leaders themselves. These type of leaders, the characteristics of these types of leaders, is what leads them to default. And so we're going to control for these other factors that might lead to irregular leadership change and might lead to defaults, and we still find an effect. We use more complicated models than this, but I just want to show you some descriptive statistics. So this is the proportion of defaults by these different leadership categories. So in the left-hand column, we have no leadership changes, and we see that these types of states default at about 0.025% of the time, and regular leadership changes. So these are leadership changes that happen in convention with the state rules, such as an election. They default at about the same rates. And then the right-hand column is the irregular changes, and we see that they are defaulting at about a 12% of the time, which is quite high because default is a rare event. Overall, we find that irregular leaders are more likely to default. It's about a 300 to 400 increase in that default risk, depending on some of the models that we use, and you can find more of that information in the article. But we think this is important for several reasons. One is it focuses on the trade-offs that leaders have when they are balancing the state's creditworthy reputation in terms of how the states can operate in financial markets, and also what makes their constituents happy. It also provides an alternative explanation to the democratic advantage, and in short, the democratic advantage is that democracies have inherent borrowing advantages in the financial markets. And it might not be about democratic rules, but that these types of states aren't necessarily having irregular leadership changes. And then finally, this ties to previous work with myself and Paul about looking at states borrowing in war. And we find that states that do get into default problems are not likely to find themselves in war. And so default behavior can help identify states' war expectations and war behavior in the future.